Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here to talk a little bit about decentralized applications, which, as Katie mentioned, is something that occupies an enormous amount of my thought space, probably too much. But the idea of a decentralized application can't really be understood unless we begin with a smart contract. So smart contracts are systems which move value according to a set of predetermined parameters and rules. It really comes down to the idea of programmable money. Now, eventually, I think we'll see decentralized applications touch all kinds of industries. But right now, there's three categories in particular where we're seeing a lot of activity. And those are open financial tools, or DeFi, as it's more commonly known, infrastructure, and gaming and digital collectibles. Now, within the open financial tools category, payments, credit and lending, and decentralized exchanges are some of the areas with the most activity. Now, payments might seem to be a pretty functional category if you think about it from a US perspective, but the picture is really not quite so rosy when you consider it through a global lens. 65% of the world's population does not have access to payment systems. Even in areas where payment systems are accessible, they're often cost prohibitive. So companies like Western Union often charge north of 15 to 20% in order to move money across borders. Even in places like the United States, where obviously we all use credit cards, credit card companies are often engaging in rent-seeking behavior, collecting high fees, costs which are passed first to the merchant and then eventually back to the consumer as well. Studies have shown that digital transfers of value have a number of benefits. They can reduce crime, corruption, and expense of moving money, and they can increase safety, transparency, and accountability, and also encourage responsible saving habits. According to a 2017 study done by the World Bank, of the 1.7 billion people worldwide, 1.1 billion, or about 65%, do have access to a mobile device. Now, this is an important point because it really shows that we already have the infrastructure for much of the developing world to jumpstart or leapfrog traditional financial services and move directly into a universe of crypto-enabled payments. Now, obviously, the picture is not entirely rosy. There are certainly limitations in the payment system on blockchains as we see them today. So, in reality, there's three main issues in blockchain payments right now: speed and volume of transactions, along with the associated costs, token volatility, and hard-to-use interfaces. So on the first point, if we think about Visa processes about a few thousand transactions per second, whereas, as was mentioned earlier, Ethereum can process about 15, Bitcoin about 7, and that's kind of under ideal conditions. So obviously that's not really going to scale. The good news is that there's a number of solutions that are being worked on, both at layer 1, meaning new blockchains which are designed to be able to process a much higher volume of transactions at any given time, as well as layer 2 solutions, which are basically built one layer above and meant to enable existing platforms to scale to a higher volume of transactions. So I'll touch on both in a moment. And on the final point of user-centric design, a number of projects are starting to really build with the consumer in mind. Rather than just saying, oh, this is a great technological application, what do we do with it? They're actually designing for their target demographic, which I think is a fundamental shift in thinking. So one project that is doing great work on a number of these fronts is Cello. So Cello is an easy-to-use mobile payment app that is built on its own blockchain, and it allows for stable value transfer from one phone number to another. So the Cello team is really seeking to provide banking services or financial services to the several billion people worldwide who don't have access to those today. They've been doing field research and are running pilots in a number of places, including this refugee camp in Tanzania. The idea here is for Cello to become not just a single application, but really an open platform upon which a number of other applications, things like cash transfer programs, peer-to-peer lending, and small-scale collaborative insurance can all be built. Another project that's also innovating in the payment space from a very different perspective is the Lightning Network. So the Lightning Network was initially conceived of as something that could help scale Bitcoin. by basically creating these bidirectional payment channels. So if you and I need to transfer money back and forth, or we need to send money to somebody else, we don't necessarily need to put each and every one of those transactions on the blockchain. Instead, we'll only put a transaction on the blockchain when we're opening or closing a channel. And so that helps to really reduce the amount of blockchain bloat that we see in networks like Bitcoin or any other network that the Lightning Network is built upon. So aside from payments, credit and lending is one of the areas that has really started to take off in the crypto space. The interesting thing here is that it enables a fundamentally more fair access to credit landscape than what we see today. And the reason for that is because right now, much of the activity in the space involves on-chain collateralization. So that basically makes it much easier to price risk and allows for credit to be extended to basically the long tail of users, which would not otherwise be able to be serviced by banks or traditional lenders. So it'd be impossible to talk about credit and lending without mentioning MakerDAO, which I think is one of the most fascinating projects in the space. This is a very simplified version of the diagram, so forgive me for those who get in the technical weeds if I give a high-level overview. But basically the way it works is a user can say, okay, I have $150, let's say, worth of Ether, and I want to get access to working capital. So what I do is I move my Ether, which serves as collateral, into a smart contract. In return, I receive $100 worth of DAI, so the minimum collateralization requirement is 150%. Once I have this DAI, which is the native stablecoin of the Maker system, I can go and use that to reinvest or as working capital for a business or for any other purpose that I might need it for. Once I decide to close out my debt position, I pay back the amount that I had borrowed and am returned my collateral minus a fee. So I think Maker is a really interesting example here because in their first year and a half of existence, they issued $200 million worth of these effective self loans. And that is, if we want to look at a public market comp like Lending Club, it took Lending Club 5 years to get to that kind of utilization metric. So I think this is an important point because one of the often heard criticisms about crypto is that nobody's really using it. And instead, we're starting to see here that there are real examples of utility that is being had now rather than at some far off point in the future. Now, of course, credit and lending also has its limitations. One thing that we're seeing is that the market is not yet really balanced. So there are more lenders than there are borrowers at present. But what we're starting to see is as the space matures and more folks begin to participate in these, we're moving closer and closer towards equilibrium. And I think we'll continue to see that trend over the next few months. So decentralized exchanges are one of, I think, the most important yet most poorly understood areas of the decentralized financial landscape. So effectively what they do is they allow peer-to-peer, or in some cases peer-to-smart contract trading. So this eliminates the need for a centralized intermediary, which often carries a number of risk. You've all seen the headlines of major cryptocurrency exchanges being hacked. Even some of the most prominent and well-run ones like Binance was hacked to the tune of $40 million a few weeks back. So the potential of decentralized exchanges is to really avoid having this single point of failure, minimizing hacks, and at the same time enabling a more transparent trading environment where it's more difficult to manipulate price or fake trading volumes, as many centralized exchanges have done. So one example of an interesting model of a decentralized exchange is Yunus Whap. Yunus Whap was launched towards the end of 2018 and has seen skyrocketing growth since then. So the idea is that market makers contribute liquidity into a smart contract, and takers then pay a small fee and are able to trade with the smart contract. So this is a fundamental innovation relative to what we had typically seen, in which participants could only trade with other peers, because this model basically helps smooth out the order book and provides better trading experience for both sides of the market. So 0x is not exactly a decentralized exchange, but it's a decentralized exchange protocol. So what does that mean? It basically enables trading of Ethereum-based assets on the blockchain. And the idea here is really to create a shared network of liquidity that different types of participants can plug into. So Radar and Ledger DEX, for example, are two examples of relayers or decentralized exchange interfaces that are built on the protocol. Gods Unchained is a game. Veil is a prediction market. And basically what 0x enables is all of these projects no longer need to reinvent the wheel and basically build everything from scratch themselves, but they can instead plug in, use 0x's functional building blocks, and very importantly, plug into the liquidity network that 0x enables. One of the biggest criticisms of decentralized exchanges is there is no liquidity. And while that's definitely true, something like 0x is a step in the right direction because, again, it really helps each of these projects contribute to a global liquidity pool, which is much more effective than what they'd be able to do on their own. Now, the topic of compliance and regulation is, of course, very top of mind given the audience. And I would say one of the problems that decentralized exchanges have seen is really that they haven't necessarily prioritized compliance or KYC AML checks. The good news is that's starting to change as more and more projects are really starting to take that very seriously and allocate resources towards making sure that the folks who are using their protocols and services are actually in compliance. So I've touched on payments, credit and lending, decentralized exchanges, but that's really only a small subset of what's happening in the DeFi space today. There's a lot of great entrepreneurs building various things in the room today. So I would certainly encourage you to chat with them because I personally think it's one of the most exciting categories. So outside of the financial realm, we're certainly seeing a lot of innovation in the infrastructure category as well. Central to that idea is really the concept of a resource token. So resource tokens can be considered something that basically allocates scarce computing resources with real-world value. And that can be anything from processing power to storage, memory, bandwidth, various things. They really come down to kind of an extension of the sharing economy. So in the same way that Airbnb allowed you to share your physical space, Uber and Lyft have allowed a network of riders and drivers to communicate and collaborate with one another, what we're seeing here is that the same thing can be done with some of these digital resources. So one example you may have heard of is Filecoin. The idea with Filecoin is really saying, okay, look, there are tons of computers, unused memory space all over the world. Why should we be paying a centralized intermediary like AWS when we could actually be using one another's resources? And there's a few benefits to doing this. Number one, obviously cost. So this creates a competitive marketplace in which vendors can basically compete on price. But what it also does, it can actually improve reliability. So on the days when, say, AWS goes down, half the internet seems broken. And what we're thinking here is that really with a decentralized network, we'll eliminate a single point of failure and move towards a more robust internet. The third category that's seeing a lot of innovation right now is that of gaming and digital collectibles. So gaming has really led the way in terms of technology development for many of the past important waves in technology. So anything from social to mobile to cloud. And I think blockchain is the next wave of that. It's also a market that I think is often misunderstood because folks think of it as something small or cutesy or a bit of a toy. But in reality, there's serious money in this category. So Fortnite, which you may be familiar with, is a massive, not blockchain-based, but general game. It, at this point, has north of 250 million users who spend hours and hours each week playing the game. And the company did $2.4 billion in revenue. So the opportunity there is really sizable. What's interesting about blockchain-based games is that they align incentives between participants in a way that hasn't really been possible in gaming before. What this comes down to is eliminating some of the middlemen who sit between gamers and game developers, and instead passing that value back to the game creators and the game players. So one example of a company that's doing really interesting work in this category is Rally. It's being built by extremely experienced gaming executives who really understand the market. But interestingly enough, what it really comes down to is it's a game extension that's built for Twitch. So Twitch is a very popular game streaming platform. And the idea is that gamers who stream on Twitch want better ways to engage with their audiences. They also want better ways to monetize them. The streamers, or the watchers of the streams, if you will, want to engage with the gamers that they're watching, and they also want to have something of value out of the exchange as well. So what Rally does is it basically enables viewers to engage with the gamers, creating digital assets that can then be traded in an open marketplace, which is not owned by Twitch. So it really comes down to this idea of having more of the value held by the creators and the players. Digital collectibles are really what catalyze the idea of blockchain-based gaming. And I think it's important to consider them as kind of a part of a broader trend, really, of the physical world moving into the digital. So we're all spending more and more time on our computers, kind of interacting in this digital space. So it makes sense that the physical collectibles world, which is a $200 billion market and includes anything from Beanie Babies to baseball cards, is now starting to move into the digital realm as well. At the core of how digital collectibles work is the concept of a non-fungible token, or NFT. NFTs are interesting because I think, the first thing that might come to mind is, oh, this is a digital representation of something else. But the unique thing about them is that they are actually unique, scarce, and provably scarce digital assets. Because they're tracked on a blockchain, we can verify that there is only one and that you have possession of it. Nobody else can. And that's something that's very important in the collectibles world, where it's otherwise difficult, even in the physical realm, to prove that you have the one unique item. CryptoKittys was the first kind of digital collectible game that really moved the category into the mainstream. So CryptoKittys launched towards the end of 2017, and all of a sudden basically blew up. It was great, it was getting all kinds of traction, and what it really showed was that we actually fundamentally need to work on some of the infrastructure in order to have games reach massive scale. Basically what happened is the game was a little bit too popular for its own good, and effectively the Ethereum blockchain was completely overloaded with transactions. So if anyone was trying to get a legitimate transaction through, they couldn't because people were breeding cats on the blockchain. Sounds funny, but I think it was actually a very important thing to see because it catalyzed a lot of conversations about what should we be doing to scale blockchains, how can we address speed, scalability, and interoperability. So if we want to actually be able to own these items, we want to be able to move them across various chains as well. And so a lot of those conversations were sparked as a result of what happened with CryptoKittys. So we've touched on open financial tools and what's happening in the decentralized financial world. We've touched on infrastructure and resource allocation in some of these networks. And we've covered a little bit about gaming and digital collectibles. I think the interesting thing is, right now, this is what's going on. But the promise of what's to come, I think, is really anybody's guess. What has me very excited about working in this space, and honestly gets me up every day, is knowing that there's an incredible group of technologists, developers, builders, thinkers, who have all moved into the space and are starting to innovate across industries. So I'm excited to see what they build next. Thank you.